say a little bit about those two thinkers a bit more, because I think Weber's one of those people that outside of, well, he sits interestingly, doesn't he, on borders of all sorts of disciplines. He's mentioned as a historian, he's a kind of anthropologist, he's a kind of sociologist, but I think he's, as you said, he is this great theorist of civilization. There's something very big and encompassing about him, and some of the things that he said are very important influence, even if he gets it wrong. I wonder whether you could just say a little bit about him. And Karl Jaspers is another one who I think he's a name philosophers have heard a little bit about him, sociologists. But again, he has, you know, the axial theory and all that. He's very important and perhaps a little forgotten in a way that perhaps we need to bring him back a little bit more and get people to think more about these two.
Well, let's separate them. I'll do Max Weber first. Weber was, when I gave my lectures on great thinkers, I ended up obviously with Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, and I used to talk about them as mountains which you had to climb mentally. You had to understand their lives and their theories, and you climbed up them. And when you stood on Mount Tocqueville or Mount Montesquieu, you looked out at the world in a different way. And I used to say when I lectured on Weber that he was the only mountain I couldn't climb. Near the top, you got into cloud. His work is so dense, complex, rich, and contradictory that it's very, very difficult. There are some very good intellectual portraits, Reinhard Bendix and so on, intellectual portraits of Weber. So it's easy to understand some of the broad outlines. But in his very short intellectual life, he died at 56 and he had mental problems for some years. So his intellectual life is only a matter of a couple of decades. And in that time, he took on the whole world and all the different subjects, ancient history, the Greeks. He was astounding. Now, how did he do this? And he did it partly through, obviously, his brilliance and his energy and so on, but also by developing a number of methods. And it's the Weberian methodology, which is one of the most important things to learn from him. How can you understand and compare different civilizations, which is what he did? Because what is a civilization? A civilization is often defined as a style or a set of customary behaviors. So people belong to a civilization because they share some very deep features. So everyone within Islam of all the different sects have certain predispositions, habitus, and common ways of looking at the world. Everyone within the Anglosphere, the Americans, the British, the Australians, the Canadians, their language, their history, their culture tells them to look at the world in a rather similar way. So there are these civilizations, but they're huge. They can often be billions of people spread, and they're spread across the world. Now, how do you get to their essence? And how do you compare them? Getting to their essence is one problem, and both Weber and Tocqueville had very good methods of doing this, going back to the point of departure with Tocqueville, which I've talked about, and so on. One of Weber's most important methods, which is, again, very simple, is the idea that you build up a set of predictions, a model, as it's often called, a simplified version of reality, a set of interconnected features which gives you a set of predictions about how a place is going to be. And then you look to see how different it is from your model. This is how Sherlock Holmes worked with his detective work. He built up, and other great detectives, they built up a model of how human beings normally behave and what you should expect of the world. And then when something bizarre, strange, the dog that didn't bark or whatever occurs. Dogs normally bark when a stranger comes in. Why did they? So you build up a model of reality and then compare different cases, because when you're comparing whether it's people or civilizations, you will find some things are the same and some things are different. There are resemblances and differences between cousins, between parents and children, and between France and Italy. Now, Weber elaborated this into some famous distinctions between forms of his model, forms of authority, for example, charismatic, where you have a great leader who comes and sweeps everything away, and then it forms into a bureaucratic civilization, and everything is written down and the rules are there and everything is, and so on. So he had different forms of authority and law and so on as different models. And taking these, so he would look at a traditional civilization, and then he would see how much and in what ways India, China, the West differed and what was the same. Because the point about civilization work is not to see the difference above all between civilizations, but the similarities as well. Because we're living in a world where civilizations are crashing into each other the whole time. That's why it's all so interesting and confusing. And if we think of someone from another civilization is entirely different from us, then we're just going to have mutual misunderstanding and possibly a world war. If we say, well, they are humans and they have many things which they share with us, but this is how they are different. And once we understand that their family system or their religion or their whatever is different, but their taste in food or novels or this or that is similar, then you can begin to appreciate there are bridges of understanding between civilizations. So from my time when I compared Japan and England, which were two very different civilizations, and through the work on great thinkers, and then as I worked more and thought more about China, I wrote a set of books late on in my life, after retirement, taking 4 or 5 civilizations and trying to get at what were the generative structures, what were the, if you had, I sometimes do this with my friends who are knowledgeable about a place. So I talked to one of the leading British anthropologists of China, and I said, if you had to, if someone said, tell me the 5 things I should know about China, and then I'll understand a lot. He couldn't tell me. He never thought of it, and because he was right in it. And when he came up with things, they were very, to my mind, very peripheral. But there are, in each case, with Islam, with China, with Japan, with Britain, there are 4 or 5 or 6 things. If you know this, if you know in the British case, which we've talked about individualism, for example, or games, or humor, then you will understand the place quite well in a preliminary way. And in China, if you know about education, if you know about something about the family system, if you know about Taoism and the religious system a bit, just a bit, then a lot of it makes sense. They are keys, they are simple keys. So you reduce complexity to a beginning simplicity, and then you have an entrance to a civilization.